You're listening to Puma Podcast.
Hi, I'm Bella Perez Rubio, Puma Podcast, and you're listening to Teka Teka News. Balitang thinking, hindi breaking. In this episode,
there's a lot of unconscious bias still. I think everybody suffers from it. But when I come into a room with my husband, who's a tall Dutch guy, and we are presented like the ambassador of the Netherlands, they always think he is the ambassador and not me.
as powerful as they are, women diplomats assigned to the Philippines still run up against all sorts of bias. Listen in as they talk about breaking the glass ceiling.
We launched this Women Diplomats Network in November 2022 with participation of the diplomatic representatives of the diplomatic services of 17 EU member states.
That's Ana Ruiz, deputy head of the delegation of the European Union to the Philippines.
Our objective was to connect, initially for connecting and reinforcing the linkages between the External Action Service, so the EU Female Diplomatic Network, and the female diplomatic networks in our member states. Because so far we didn't have any contacts between ourselves as female diplomats.
Ruiz was speaking at an event organized by the Asia Society last week. It featured members of the Women Diplomats Network of the EU, or WEDIN EU, as panelists. Given the overall progress in Europe, it might be surprising to learn that representation for women in foreign policy is a fairly new thing for some of its members.
The number of diplomats that Romania had is probably less than half the number of women diplomats you had.
That's Ambassador Raduta Matake, and you heard her right. The Philippines has more than double the number of Romania's female diplomats. Here's why.
Before 1989, we were a so-called communist country. Well, a communist dictatorship will never be friendly to women. So the fact that women like me coming from modest backgrounds reached to the rank of ambassador is due to democracy and is due to the extraordinary changes that happened in Romania in the last 30 years.
In her country, Ambassador Matake is the exception, not the rule. And the same goes for many of her colleagues in the Women Diplomats Network. Listen to Czech Republic's envoy to the Philippines, Jana Sedeva.
And before 89, we did not have any female ambassador till 89, zero. And we had only like 2 or 3 female colleagues at the foreign ministry. We had only one member of parliament. And now it's 33 years after the, in our case, Velvet Revolution, but since we have the democracy, it's improving, but it's very slow process.
The inextricable link between women's rights and democracy is something these ambassadors experienced firsthand. Here's Ambassador Sedeva again.
I never could go to university if the revolution would not happen. So, because I did not have the good, origin that time, if you were not from the prominent communist families, you could not get at university. So, of course, I could not get to the ministry. So, I can be here with you only because we have democracy.
A few other EU countries have successfully bridged the gender gap in diplomacy. Take Sweden, for example.
In the foreign service, we are 50-50 in terms of, between men and women. We have the idea that 50-50 at all the levels, that is a good idea because the aim is to have 50-50 because we believe that it's good to have a balance of gender. And of course, gender policies are mainstreamed into all our policies, no matter what it is, abroad or at home.
That's Ambassador Annika Thunborg. But even in Sweden, a country that often gets top marks in UN gender equality reports, progress took time.
I was born in the 1960s, And the 1960s was, of course, a very important period for social movements in big parts of the world, and including the feminist movement. So that laid the framework, they laid the groundwork for a lot of the changes that came in the 1970s and that my generation could benefit from.
It was Ambassador Thunborg's class of diplomats that finally managed to level the playing field.
But it wasn't always like this, and of course the Foreign Service is often a bit conservative, you may know that, and when I started at the Foreign Ministry in 1997, it was still very male-dominated, and so it lagged behind other sectors in society, but then changes came with my generation. We were the first ones that started at the ministry in the sort of, we call it the diplomatic program, where we were actually 50-50 in more or less among the people who were then accepted in the diplomatic program.
We'll pause here, but when we return, more on the Women Diplomats Network's plan to close the gender gap in foreign service. The effort to formalize women's participation in the European Union's diplomatic service started years ago, and for good reason.
The proportion of female in the Philippine Foreign Affairs Department, 60% women, 40% men. In our case, it's the opposite. We have around 60% males in administrator or political officer or diplomat positions, and 40% women.
Again, that's Ana Ruiz, deputy head of the delegation of the EU to the Philippines.
There has been a progress. In 2012, women were 30%. So we had advanced. I think there has been an acceleration in the latest years because of these policy documents and this leadership in the organization. As concerns management and ambassadorial posts, we are still lagging behind, I must say. We have 62% men in middle management versus 38% women. We still have 70% men versus 30% women. So there is still a way to go.
The EU has set significant goals to address this.
Our current High Representative, Josep Borrell, has the intention of achieving 40% representation of women in all ranks in senior management by 2024. I think initially the objective was by last year, but it wasn't achieved. And in any case, there is an objective to reach gender balance in all levels of senior management by 2025.
And that's not all they're planning to do.
Because not all member states have female diplomatic networks, so one of our objectives is to provide coaching to those female colleagues in countries that don't have it, on how to organize themselves, how the networks can work.
The women diplomats also hope to usher in policy changes in their respective countries.
We also want to increase the exchanges with our member states' female colleagues on human resources matters and practices that affect the career prospects of women and the professional opportunities of women, be it on rotation, mobility, spouses, improving the work-life balance, how to encourage more women to present their candidacy to ambassadorial positions or to senior management positions, etc.
And even the Philippines, which already boasts a good number of women in foreign service, can do more. Here's Dutch Ambassador Marielle Hirats, the voice you heard at the top of this episode.
I see very strong women here in the Philippines, and I think you're doing very well in political representation, much better than the Netherlands. In diplomatic circles, you do much better. In economic life, I see many powerful women, but I think it's also probably a matter of economic development, that those who are live in certain circles or have grown up in certain privileged families, they have more opportunities than those who are in other social circles. more economic development, I think, is paramount here.
And that was today's episode of Teka Teka News. Again, I'm Bella Perez Rubio. This episode was edited by Pidoy Blanco. Did you know the Philippines played a key role in upholding women's rights worldwide? Check out our episode on Filipina diplomats from earlier this week. And if you like this episode, share it with a friend or two. And don't forget to follow Teka Teka News and Puma Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. At para sa mga mahilig manood sa YouTube, Puma Podcast na rin po kami doon. Just search Puma Podcast and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for listening.